Welcome to another in a series of Gallery Now, a review of what's happening in the Kootenay School of Art Gallery at the David Thompson University Centre. I'm your host, Ernie Underhill, curator and director of the gallery, and what's happening now is an exhibition titled Leonard Hutchinson, Master Printmaker. The works are comprised of 24 wood prints which example some of his latter works, as in this one, Above 12 Mile Creek. All these prints are made from the woodblock, and the works are probably best understood in the context of the era in which Hutchinson lived and worked. Leonard Hutchinson was born at Manchester, England in 1886. He studied art at the Colchester School of Art, a period during which the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were having a profound effect on the world of art. Hutchinson came to Canada in 1913, where he worked on the railroad to support his artistic talents. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Canadian Group of Seven were active and creating quite a furor in the critics' columns. At the outbreak of the First World War, Hutchinson returned to England and served in the Ambulance Corps in France. When the war ended, he returned to Canada, moving to Hamilton in the early 1920s and spent most of his life there. He taught for 10 years at the Hamilton Technical Institute, where he was known primarily as a painter. And this print suggests some of the kinds of things he was involved in as a painter. In the late 1920s, Hutchinson turned to printing with woodblocks, and this is the period in which most of this exhibition begins. The works on display indicate both the artist's involvement with the landscape as well as his involvement in a social consciousness. This one, titled Tobacco Workers, indicates both of these elements. Having worked at a number of jobs prior to his teaching appointment, Hutchinson had an empathy for the worker and his plight. Thus, many of these works make social comment. Again, one must reflect on the socio-economic environment that existed when these works were created. This one, called Lockout, for example. Many of the artists, the prestigious artists of the period, were painting or drawing or making engravings of young socialites or scions of the business world, whereas Hutchinson chose the worker as his model. He became involved as a graphic artist in many political issues, usually supporting the worker. As an activist during this period, he helped to raise money to fight Franco in Spain. He also organized the Hamilton branch of the Artists' Union while holding the position of curator of the prestigious Hamilton Art Gallery. After the Second World War, another facet of this artist is shown when he begins a teaching program for retarded adults in a variety of crafts. This one, Fred Fisher, a woodsman. Again, his tribute to the worker class. And Builders of Roads. Always he had this empathy for the worker. Of course, he had been a worker, having worked for the railroad on road gangs in whatever job he could find to help support his artistic pursuits. His credentials were extensive. Leonard Hutchinson was an active member of the Canadian Society of Graphic Artists, of which he became president. He was also president of the Canadian Society of Painters, Etchers, and Engravers, and an academician of the Royal Academy. He was exhibited in Canada, England, and the USA, and his works are in many public and private galleries. This one from his black and white series is a tribute to the landscape that was an important part of what the Group of Seven were doing. Caledon Hills. This is one of his more elaborate wood prints, and while by today's standards it may seem rather passé, Leonard was a pace setter in his time, and the ideas, the styles, the techniques that he derived were used by many commercial artists who were to follow. North Shore des Jardins Canal. Rather colorful woodcut. This one indicates certainly a tribute to the Japanese printmakers. Some have seen an affinity for the group of seven in much of Hutchinson's work, but of course the group of seven also allude to the Japanese print. The technique, the amount of work involved can be judged by the number of colors he's using. The initial plate or the black plate, and if you add all of the colors, it'll give you some idea of the number of wood blocks that he has cut for this particular print. A strong wood cut in one color, black, on white paper, titled Canadian Homes and Gardens. Obviously a social comment. If one can recall, Canadian Homes and Gardens in the 50s was a rather important magazine for those who were well-heeled, who had comfortable luxury homes, or had them fashioned on some of the ideas that came out of Canadian Homes and Gardens. And here he alludes to the worker's home and his garden in which he works to survive. In a similar vein, Workers' Picnic. Again, another powerful set of images depicting the workers in a more relaxed period. But his use of black and white really supports his kinds of statements. About his work, especially his prints, and especially the black and white prints, the print is the most suitable medium for one having Leonard Hutchinson's belief in the working class. It is the democratic art, the means by which original art can be made available to those who cannot afford large sums of money for paintings. And of course, by the issue of prints in which one might issue 50 to 100, he can reach a much wider audience. Burlington Bay indicates his love of the landscape, which has appeared even in those that make social comment. In this one, that may seem to have an affinity for what the group of seven about him were doing, has a very simple quality about it, which was adapted by many illustrators in magazine covers. So again, while it may seem rather outdated, outmoded today, it was a trendsetter in its time. Old barn with a mill makes use of his the approach in which he dealt with most of his social comment, but here his love of the landscape comes through, and when we look in close we can see the masterful technique he developed for cutting the wood block, how he brings life to the linear quality in these farm forms. And again, it was the beginning of a reverence for old, decayed buildings, which many artists still pursue today. Covered Bridge, Montrose. A great many of these had existed in Ontario, and again, he's captured them for posterity, most of which have been lost through the advance of progress. Here he's extended the black and white to add one other color, which takes some of the stark drama out of the previous social comment works. titled Dover Boats. This one again shows his use of the three-color, the white of the paper, the black plate, and the umber plate to suggest all the values that exist in nature. A masterful piece of composition, and it probably suggests some of the abilities that he might have had as a teacher at the Hamilton Technical Institute, where he had taught for 10 years. His use of shape and form, the distribution of light and dark, and of course his skill with the tools. Cayuga sunlight. Strong use of white forms in there, which suggests the sunlight and helps meld out a lot of the unnecessary forms. Probably well displays the artist's ability to be able to dispense with unnecessary material and to organize the whole into a composition. The strong, simple shapes of the homes are somehow reminiscent of what Lawrence Harris was doing at the same time in some of his studies that dealt with homes. And probably most of the works here suggest and describe the era in which they were done, somewhere between the 20s and 50s, where the important kinds of things that an artist was seeing and feeling and reacting to were evident amongst all the artists. And so looking at many artists who have worked in this period, you see something very similar, although they might have been far removed from one another in what they were doing. But it seems that an age has much to do with the way a person feels, and reacts. Another tribute to the class of workers, titled Logging. One has seen many similar scenes like this used as illustration. Well, Hutchinson was probably one of the first to have his work adapted for covers and illustrations of books, brochures that dealt with the industry of logging. The varying use of the tool is well displayed in this, how he indicates the movement of waves, the texture in a log, as opposed to the strong forms of figures in action. And he never leaves very far behind the element of landscape, usually in the background or playing a secondary role to the worker. The Lost Barn, again a tribute certainly to old buildings as well as workers. Much has been said of Leonard Hutchinson's inspiration from Japanese printmakers. Well, both the Impressionists and the Group of Seven had this admiration of the Japanese woodcut. And Hutchinson has said that he believes in the Japanese concept that art holds a mirror up to nature. While some of his landscapes show the delicate feeling for nature, and some of his colored prints contain the sensitive colors of the Japanese masters, in the strength and deliberation of his black and white works, he shows an independence and a feeling for a subject which is entirely his own. The Brickmaker's Wife. While the bankers and the university presidents' wives were having their portraits done by the outstanding fashion portrait painters of the day, Hutchinson was engraving for posterity the worker's wife, who he saw certainly as important as any of the wives of the upper class. His masterful use of the tool again is shown in the way he's modeled the face to suggest the soft, resilient quality of flesh, the flowing quality of lines that add an element of humanity to it. Snow on the Bay, tribute to the Canadian landscape. artists of the early nationalist period. Certainly suggests a new approach to painting, printmaking in Canada. A number of plates processed to render this one, probably about 6 plates there, and in some cases one color plate is overlapped and through the use of transparent inks has added another color, whereas in some areas the careful use of an inking roller has created a gradation suggesting a dimension or a perspective in space. But again, the simple, bold quality of the landscape that the artists of this period were looking at, as opposed to what was happening in Europe at that time. Road to Niagara. Again, a respect for the landscape. In the case of Leonard Hutchinson's work, most of his landscape tend to be the rural scene, the landscape that had been manicured by man in his advance in the building of small towns and cities. And so in some sense he was dealing with another aspect other than that of which the Group 7 were looking at. They were looking at the wild quality of the Canadian landscape, whereas Hutchinson was living in a society, and while his tribute to the worker was evident in most of these works, in the other ones that deal with the landscape, it's a landscape that's inhabited by man. Entitled The Trapper, this wood print is in black and white, and it indicates that it's the 20th print of an issue of 50. Most of these were done in issues of 50 copies. Again, this displays his proficiency with the graving tool on a block of wood, and the similar kinds of lines and quality of the lines you see in it may be seen in many prints of this particular period, in which new discoveries were happening in the technology of cutting the woodblock, a form which is not involved in today's art production as much as it was in the era of the 20s. The trapper, of course, indicates a profession that is almost dead today, but at that era there were still a lot of trappers about in Canada. Lake from the Escarpment. I think this one is probably a good example of his technique in devising methods and ways of suggesting or rendering different kinds of forms, whether they're grass-covered hills, groups of trees, fences, furrowed fields. And note how he indicates a sky that may be blue, gradating in the distance, masked with clouds, sunlight pouring through the clouds. Something rather difficult to do and interpret in a black and white. So he literally discovers a kind of shorthand for suggesting all those things, which would be of value to a student trying the complexities of wood graving. Desjardins Canal, possibly one of the most appealing of his color wood prints in the show, in the use of the forms and the very delicate quality of coloring that probably more closely assimilates a Japanese print than any of the others. It's also quite comparable to another outstanding Canadian woodblock printmaker, Walter Phillips. His compositional skills become quite evident in the way he's juxtaposed forms, in the way he's arranged the eye of the viewer to flow in and around the forms, in his balance and use of color, and the strong simplicity in which you become aware that he's organized things, and he's made a point of leaving out those which were of no value, putting only the important elements into the picture. The last of the 24 works in Leonard Hutchinson's printmaking series is this black and white titled Plenty of Nothing. And it certainly indicates his feeling for the worker and the plight of the worker of this period, a period dealing around 1920. Many workers had very little to survive on, but certainly they had high spirits, and I guess music knows no economic boundaries, as suggested in this aged worker sitting in his shack, strumming his banjo, oblivious to the problems of the world at the time. This is probably one that has made stronger use of black than any of the others, and while the black may suggest a rather ominous or pessimistic quality, the composition and the use of line is certainly quite optimistic. It's a lively, bright, dancing kind of line he uses to indicate the forms, the roundness of forms, the change in value, and certainly the starkness of the light on a white shirt. The exhibition will be on for another week until the 27th, Friday, and then it'll be followed by weekly exhibitions of some of our graduating students. They'll all be putting on a one-person exhibition for 1 week. So if you watch your news in the local paper for the dates and the name,